Welcome to the book launch for Blight by E.J. Johnson. Ed is here to answer lots of questions about his book, and I'm just going to begin by reading out his bio. And I'm Ed's publisher, Jessica Muddett, and I'm the founder of Hembury Books. Edward Johnson has worked as a barrister in workplace relations, a tribunal advocate in a large public sector trade union, and a foreign languages teacher in France, England, and Australia. His debut novel, Blight, tracks Australia's military presence in Singapore throughout World War II and is a faithful reimagining of historic events, which is informed by his father's experiences as a prisoner of war in Changi. Ed, congratulations on the publication of Blight. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling fantastic. It's a long time in gestation, and for it to be given birth now is just a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, that's amazing. What prompted you to write Blight?
Well, I suppose I've always been interested in words and languages. I started writing Blight as a memoir, but it became I had to work out what to put in, what to leave out. It became a bit unwieldy, and I found myself putting in things I never thought I would in a memoir. So it's slowly evolved into a novel. Something more complex. I'll put it that way.
Well,
it was. I had a greater ambition than just a memoir, and I've taken things obviously from my life, but my interest in history and the Second World War, especially in Southeast Asia, gave me the basis, the core of what the novel has turned out to be. Which is a hybrid, really, of fiction and fact. Faction, if you like.
Faction, yeah. And could you please tell us about Blight? Give us an overview.
Well, overview. You've got 3 hours, have you? It's sort of like saga length. It's not inordinately long, but I tried to cover mainly the psychological damage caused by warfare, as it affected intergenerational aspects of life, and I also try to incorporate the fall of Singapore and the way the British officers and the British colonialists who were there reacted to the oncoming and imminent defeat, if you like, of the British forces and the Australian forces in Malaya at that time in 1939 to 1942. Okay, so it deals with the psychological injuries, as I said earlier. So the first 2 chapters of the book deal with the son of an ex-serviceman who is still suffering from his own psychological problems because of his father. And then, of course, the last 2 chapters of the book see him trying to resolve those, and whether he's resolved those issues is sort of left up in the air. But it returns to 2015, and in the middle, the core of the novel, of course, deals with 1939 to 1942. So the central part is the history, and I've introduced a whole lot of characters, imaginary characters, fictional characters, in order to bring out what I was trying to get at the themes of light, of decay, despair, destruction, and all the other negative, malevolent things that happen in the book. And that's the way I did it, anyhow. That's the way I approached it.
Did your years as a barrister aid you in the writing of the book?
Well, yes and no. I mean, barrister has to use words a lot, use language. But a big difference, of course, is when you're a barrister or an advocate, you sort of have what's called a case concept, where from the very beginning you work out the end, if I can put it that way. So you want to use your arguments, be persuasive, use evidence, all sorts of things, cross-examinations, data, materials, particulars, etc. And you do that with a view of getting to the end you've already preconceived. Whereas being a first-time novelist, it was probably completely the reverse. I didn't know where it was going to end, until I got there. It sounds funny, I know, but it was the reverse of what a barrister does.
It's inverted.
Yeah. I was sort of moving, and during the process of writing it, I was finding different strands where the ending could be different. So it wasn't until I got to chapter 30, the last chapter, that it all sort of formed together. And hopefully it's a successful narrative arc. And hopefully the themes that arose in chapter 1 and 2 were partially resolved by the end, or at least thematically approached and tried to be resolved there.
And why did you decide to start the book in 2015 Melbourne and then jump back to 1939?
Well, I suppose, I'm living in Melbourne, so a lot of the things there are informed by my living experience here. 15, the reason that was chosen was because most of the soldiers, even the youngest who volunteered at the outbreak of 1939 war, the World War, as volunteers for the army and the combined services, they would be now at 215, getting on towards 90 years of age. So since I had a few characters, including one of the principal characters, who's talked about quite a lot, would have been getting on in life, I needed to make it what's called verisimilitude. It had to really be credible that the people alive in 215 would have served in World War II. Any later, and you're sort of testing the credibility a little bit. Yep. So the actual time shift from 215 to 1939, I controlled that by having the period from 1939 to 45 related from a series of diaries. So the diaries, which intermittently come into view throughout the novel, form the basis of the dialogues and the narrative and the descriptions during that period. So to come back to 215 was the idea of resolving what had occurred at the beginning, in order to reserve that post-traumatic stress disorder that the character at the outset, Simon Roberts, has. Has Simon Roberts actually learnt from his experience in reading the diaries? Has he learnt about what his character has been like? And has he been able to resolve all those conflicts with the psychiatrist in chapters 1 and 2, in chapters 29 and 30? So that's what I was aiming for. So that's why the 215 to 139, so 1939 to 45, two discrete sort of eras, but they overlap, of course, in the narration.
Yeah. I see. Could you tell us, please, about your father and how his imprisonment in Changi influenced your decision to write Blight?
Well, it started a little bit as a memoir about my life, our family life, but of course, the character that is the father in the novel is a great exaggeration. It is fiction, and it's informed, partially by my experiences with my father and his experiences in Changi. He didn't talk much about it, which was fairly typical of returned servicemen. They sort of bottled things up. But he did have a lot of resentment towards the Japanese. He did have a lot of bigotry and racism. And of course, he represented the type of Australian who was born in the 1920s and into the 1930s and 40s. That's typical of that sort of era and that sort of person. So I had to realistically recreate that through the character that I created. His experiences in Changi, he never talked about them much, but I remember as a small child, he used to go to the Concord Repatriation Hospital in Sydney for treatment of hookworm, and hookworm is contracted through treading on feces in the jungle. So you don't get it by wearing boots and doing marching military parades. You get it by having bare feet and suffering deprivation in your accommodation, if you put it that way, while a prisoner. So obviously he had been to those camps, but he never talked about there were, 30 or 40 different staging camps along that Burma to Siam railway. And those, there's been many books, including Richard Flanagan's book, of course, The Narrow Path to the North. He actually focuses on the suffering and the torment of soldiers on that Burma railway. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to look at the psychological damage and how it's reflected in those who survived and is transferred almost like an infection, like a blight, to successive generations. And the book deals with a lot of things that are a blight on life, including racism, including bigotry, including warfare, treatment of different people, and how we cope with the results of warfare. They're the sorts of themes which I was more interested in than just depicting the suffering
Horrors.
of the the 8th Division soldiers in Singapore.
In the context of war, we often talk about male relationships in terms of mateship, loyalty, and camaraderie. Can you elaborate on what interested you about male relationships in your book?
Yeah, that's an ongoing theme, that the idea of male relationships, and of course, you need to have that camaraderie, if you like, in the army, that unity. It also is it's sort of in that era, 1939 onwards, until recent times, women tended to be excluded, even though they were in the armed forces, and they did a fantastic job with the munitions back home in Australia. So it was a male-dominated society, and some would say it still is. It's a patriarchy, if you like. But the other side of the coin is that it's also a solidifying sort of idea, having mateship, which means you can sort of withstand lots of deprivations, which obviously the prisoner of war soldiers experienced in Burma and Siam. There's a little part in my novel in chapter 9 where I talk about, well, the omniscient narrator talks about the relationships in warfare, and he says that an undivided loyalty to one's mates, adherence to a set of unarticulated democratic values, and a robust attachment to the prevailing mythology of a brief but heroic military heritage is what sort of was an amalgam of those soldiers. And he makes the point that this was a holy trinity of their own, which would take precedence over their more tenuous allegiance to God, king, and country. The democratic values, the attachment to the mythology of military heritage, and those sorts of things, loyalty to one's mates, that was the holy trinity of the soldiers during the war. And if it's called mateship or it's called patriarchy or whatever, that's the reality.
Were you nervous to tackle the genre of historical fiction?
Yes and no. I mean, it just evolved that way into historical fiction. I know nothing about the process of doing it. I'm sort of exploring as I was going, and hopefully it turned out to be a reasonable attempt at that sort of thing. But I'm reminded by one of my editors, who will remain anonymous, but she made the comments about, well, all the normal things that first-time novelists go through, they put in too much tell and not enough show. So, too much historical data. So she put it very aptly as a metaphor and said, when you're writing a historical novel, make sure you wear your history lightly. She likened it to an iceberg. And she said, the tip of the iceberg should be your devotion to the historicity, if you like, or the historical factual nature of it. Beneath the iceberg, the subtext is what you base it on, but you don't expose it. It's only seen at the top. So she was saying, got to have that basic understanding that you don't put too much history in, because it's going to spoil the purpose of a novel. And yet a literary novel without the history wouldn't be a historical fiction. So it's a very, very fine balancing act. And obviously there are very skilled writers in the world who can do it fabulously and balance them. I was just trial and error, and I tried not to be too didactic, too historical. But I got to the stage where I thought, if I eliminate any more of the straight historical fact, because it is based on facts, historical events, if I leave out too much of that background, it's going to detract from the whole purpose I had, which was to have a satirical view of the British who were there, a reasonable account of why Singapore fell militarily, and I go through that at some length, but I felt that was necessary. So, to answer your original question, it was trepidation, because I knew however much I tried, I was never going to be completely successful in amalgamating those two sides, of the literary and the historical.
Can you tell us about the research that you did for this book, and if it ever felt overwhelming deciding what to leave in and what to leave out?
Well, yeah, the research at the back of the novel, I make some acknowledgements where there's a lot of journal articles I read, also Biblio Asia from the Singapore Library Board. I read their journals for an understanding of the culture in Singapore in 1939. I travelled to Singapore. I went around Chinatown quite a bit, and I used the museum there in Chinatown as a basis for one of the chapters in the book. So it's my representation of what I felt, what I learned from going into Pagoda Street in the heart of Chinatown in Singapore. So the research was widespread. It was included, I read Burmese Days, George Orwell, for an understanding of the colonial mentality. And it's a big part of my book, which deals with a reception at Pym, the emissary from Winston Churchill, Pym's big reception, where lots of the British colonialists are present, and I make observations there on the plantation culture, etc., and their racism towards the Chinese and the Malay. So the research gave me that basis upon which to work out the fiction. The fictional characters jumped out at me from the history, if you like, and made it easier to create a figure. There are stereotypes there, and a few cliches, of course, but I started to think, well, people can be accused of using stereotypes and cliches, but I was thinking of Geoffrey Chaucer, probably the best or the earliest writer in English language. And he used all these different characters, and so he'd probably be accused of appropriating different characters these days. But I mean, he wrote about nuns, priests, a miller. He wrote about all these different pilgrims going in the Canterbury Tales, or the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So he was like one of the first appropriators of characters and a builder of stereotypes. And so I had no hesitation in using what I thought were stereotypical people in that colonial era. Whether it was 100% accurate or not, I don't care. It's fiction. But it has a basis there in literature.
Simon has a fragile relationship with his father, in part because he considers him to be racist and prejudiced. Were you interested in understanding how prejudice operates differently in certain time periods, or more about the stain that old school beliefs leave on the current climate?
Yeah, he was bigoted, and racial prejudice is still strong in our society. It's a more enlightened society. But attitudes towards Asians in Singapore, the Aborigines in Australia in 1939 were somewhat different, somewhat primitive compared to what they are today. So the novel attempts to approach the issue of racial discrimination from an intergenerational learnt behaviour, and an intolerance which is derived from a lack of education, if you like. blurb on the cover of the book posits the proposition that we often form our views on what we see and not necessarily on what we understand. So that sort of statement, it sounds very bland, but it's what I sort of thought about the whole concept of racism as it appears in the book. And in general, we don't understand. We often take our view on what we see rather than what we understand. And when we start to understand better, that's when those sorts of prejudices tend to dissipate.
Visiting his father in the hospital, the narrator Simon says to himself, "Your PTSD didn't have to become my enduring legacy." Can you tell the viewers a bit more about PTSD and how it plays out in your book?
Yes, as I've probably said it already, but post-traumatic stress syndrome is what the son of the digger suffers as much as the digger himself. And of course, there was a fantastic book came out by a Monash University professor. I forget her name at the moment, but I've used her name. I've used her book to talk about the stress that people had on returning home, and it sort of was covered up, and I've mentioned that already. So there were no real outlets for diggers in those days, and even today with the Vietnam veterans, they're still trying to get some compensation for the stress that they suffered during warfare. What is it? Well, it's funny because it was recognised by the High Court in the 1960s, I think, for the first time, post-traumatic stress disorder. But soldiers had a very, very difficult time after World War II, even though they had psychiatric injury, mental disturbances. They had very little recourse to compensation or to help. And government instrumentalities and government doctors generally didn't recognise it, were prone not to recognise it. And so soldiers really didn't get any compensation until fairly recently in relation to PTSD. Once again, that you mentioned earlier, the mateship, the maleness in society, the patriarchy, there was a bit, of course, of that involved. A bit of a sissy if you had a mental illness. So soldiers are not supposed to get mental illnesses. When of course the reverse is true. So yeah, that's I can remember my father's going to I don't know, meetings with other men. Maybe it was just conversations over a few beers, but he never talked about it, and he certainly didn't go to any psychiatrists about it. It was all kept up, bottled inside. It was repressed.
And to not have a psychiatric illness after such experiences would be virtually impossible.
Possibly, yeah. I don't know. There are some people who are really hard, and it doesn't affect them externally. It doesn't seem to, but probably inside. There's the war within is the book, or the battle within is the book that I mentioned. I read by that Monash professor, yes, and she was very good in isolating those incidents, and also the poor support that they got.
My final question for you, Ed, is what is next for you? Would you consider tackling a different historical period?
Would a different historical period? If it was another book that was a historical fiction, I'd probably base it on contemporary Australia.
Okay.
And a political book, perhaps exploring some of the issues that have been around for 10, 20 years, dominating politics in Australia. Then you don't have the worry that what you're going to write about is anachronistic. I was always worried about, was the language that I was using appropriate for 1939? And there's a lot of vernacular in my book. There's a lot of Australianisms, if you like. And hopefully they strike a chord, maybe with the older generation. The new generation wouldn't have a clue about them. So I don't care if you have to run to Wikipedia or dictionaries to look them up. They're part of Australia's history, cultural history. That's another thing I wanted to do. I wanted to make it realistic about the era I was writing about. But to have a modern, if I had another go at something, it'd be modern, so I wouldn't have to worry about the slang, the attitudes, etc. It'd be contemporary,
You'd
and
be afraid of that.
I'd be much freer. Yeah.
You have an interest in the trade union movement.
Yeah, and without wanting to preempt anything, I probably that political book would have trade union activity involved as a work of fiction. So yeah, I would use that experience as a basis.
Okay, yes, okay, not non-fiction about the trade union movement.
No. It'd be fictional, but once again, based on my experiences of trade unions.
That would be amazing. I've never heard of a fiction book tackling that.
Yeah. There are lots of British ones, of course, where they've done, television series and books based on party leaders, ex-party leaders, people who've died, the Christine Keeler case, that sort of thing. They all come to mind, and there's probably not that many in Australia that have dealt specifically with political persons. Of course, I'd have to worry a little bit more about defamation. Whereas the Blight book, there's no one. Most of the people would be died years ago that you could perhaps link to a real person living today. But you have to be very careful with your defamation actions if you did something contemporary and satirical and humorous, which is sort of my style.
Well, you know better than anyone how to defend yourself, so I think you'll be fine.
Well, I don't know how I was defending myself today. Probably get someone else and to do the brief.
You would do all the checks necessary because you'd be so aware of defamation and the risks that it could pose that you wouldn't be reckless, would you?
No. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Anyhow, I think I've put my house in my wife's name a long time ago to avoid any payouts. So, but obviously, my book comes with a trigger warning. It's MA 15 plus. There's not lots of, but there's some straightforward sexual assaults in there. There's some murders, and there's lots of coarse language. So I tick all those boxes to offend people, but hopefully enough of them will buy it to be offended and be happy at the same time.
It'll be good value for money. Congratulations on the publication of Blight, which is available as a paperback and ebook at all global online retailers.